Friday night in Indianapolis felt different in ways that don't happen often. The kind of night where conversations stopped mid-sentence, where people pulled up games they normally would have skipped, where even casual fans felt like they were witnessing something that might not come around again for years. Caitlin Clark was doing something on a basketball court that almost nobody in the entire history of professional basketball had ever managed to pull off. When that final buzzer sounded, the basketball world wasn't just celebrating. It was trying to process what had actually just happened on the floor. But what came next would reveal something far more complicated about how the league treats its biggest star. And by Saturday morning, everyone would be asking the same question. How does a sport go from celebrating history to punishing the person who made it in less than 24 hours? The numbers told the story that made analysts reach for historical comparisons they rarely get to make. 45 points, 10 assists, 4 steals, 2 blocks. That wasn't just a good game. That was a stat line so rare, so historically unreal, that only 4 other players across the entire landscape of professional basketball, men's and women's combined, had ever strung together anything remotely like it. And she did it in under 30 minutes of playing time. She was still operating under a minute's restriction that her coaching staff hadn't lifted yet. The bench had been holding her back, and somehow she'd still managed to join one of the most exclusive clubs in the sport's history. Think about what that actually means. There are thousands of professional basketball players throughout history. Thousands, and only a handful, maybe 5 or 6 total across every era, have ever put together a night like Friday. That's the rarity we're talking about. That's the level of performance Clark produced while the people coaching her were actively limiting her time on the court because of health concerns. Imagine what she's capable of at full capacity. That's what people were thinking when the final whistle blew. The comparisons started immediately, and they weren't random. Michael Jordan's name was getting thrown around. Luka Doncic. Social media ran out of superlatives before the post-game interviews even finished. Analysts were pulling footage, cross-referencing stat lines, trying to find a comparison that felt adequate. For one complete night, the entire conversation around Caitlin Clark was purely about basketball, about what she'd accomplished on the floor, about what it meant for the record books, about where her career trajectory was actually heading if she was capable of producing performances like this while still working through a minute's restriction. The celebration felt clean, historical, undeniable. Every major sports outlet led with the performance. Social media timelines filled with highlight reels on repeat. Casual fans who didn't follow women's basketball closely were suddenly pulling up box scores. This was the kind of night that transcends league boundaries. This was the kind of night that belongs in highlight packages forever. Arena crowds had erupted. Her teammates had mobbed her. The entire Fever organization was basking in what felt like a generational talent moment. Everything about the narrative was positive. Everything felt like momentum. Everything felt like growth. Then came Saturday. 90 seconds. That's the actual amount of time it took for the entire conversation to flip completely. 90 seconds into Indiana's next game against the New York Liberty, Clark caught a hard screen set by Liberty center John Cale Jones. She went down to the floor. She looked for the foul call that should have been there. It didn't come. She got up, said something to the nearest official, the kind of thing that happens thousands of times in basketball games every single week, and got handed a technical foul before she'd even gotten her bearings. Her 6th technical of the season. $1,000 out of her own pocket before the game had barely started moving. Suddenly, the same player who just joined one of the rarest clubs in basketball history was now sitting with only 2 technical fouls left standing between her and an automatic 1-game suspension. The celebrations from Friday hadn't even finished circulating through social media. The slow-motion highlight reels were still bouncing around every timeline. And the league had just found its most watched player before she'd even settled into her 2nd game of the weekend. The timing wasn't just bad. The contrast was stark enough to feel intentional to everyone watching. You couldn't have scripted a more jarring narrative shift if you tried. The whiplash was real. Friday's historic performance became almost irrelevant noise by Saturday evening. Indiana actually won the game decisively. Kelsey Mitchell dropped 33 points, and the Fever closed it out, 108-88, a meaningful road victory against a team that had beaten them earlier. By any objective measure, that was a strong win with real playoff implications for a team fighting to position itself in a conference that had tightened significantly. They were 15-10, right in the mix. But the win barely registered in headlines. What registered was the technical. What registered was the fine. What registered was the math that everyone could do instantly. 6 down, 2 to go before a mandatory night sitting on the bench. Fans had spent the previous night celebrating one of the greatest individual performances they'd ever witnessed in women's basketball. Now they were spending this night counting fouls like a suspension clock was ticking down in real time. How does a sport go from witnessing one of the rarest statistical performances in its history to disciplining the person who produced it less than 24 hours later? That question landed hard. It landed quietly in some places and explosively in others. But it was the question everyone was asking. And that question was about to lead somewhere much deeper than anyone initially realized. That whiplash wasn't random. It wasn't bad timing. It wasn't an unfortunate coincidence for anyone who'd been watching the entire season carefully. It was the latest explosion in something that had been building for months, one disputed whistle at a time. To understand why Saturday felt like the culmination of a much longer story, the context goes all the way back to June, because that's where this actually begins. That's where the pattern first appeared, and that's where the league made a decision that would set everything that followed in motion. Clark had picked up a technical foul against the Phoenix Mercury, in a game that fans and analysts immediately flagged as questionable at best. It was the kind of call that disappears for most players. It's the kind that referees typically swallow in the heat of a physical moment and move forward from without making it into something. But this one didn't disappear. The league reviewed it. Instead of rescinding it, the way they'd done for other players earlier in that same season, the WNBA upheld it. That single decision lit something that had been waiting for a spark. Not because one technical is a catastrophe, it's not. Players get technicals all the time. It's part of competitive basketball. But because of what that decision revealed about how Clark's situation was being handled compared to every other player on the court. The same league that had rescinded similar calls for other players earlier that season chose to let this one stand. That inconsistency was the real issue, and fans noticed it immediately. Screenshots of the decision started circulating within hours. Social media filled with side-by-side comparisons, players with similar on-court behavior, players with comparable frustration levels, players who'd said or done considerably more in heated moments. None of them were drawing the same level of scrutiny. None of them were getting hit with the same disciplinary outcomes. Why does a call that gets rescinded for one player stand for another in the exact same season? That question became the lens through which every technical that came after would be viewed. It never went away. From that moment forward, fans were tracking every whistle. Every call involving Clark was being examined with a precision that normally only happens in playoff moments. Screenshots of the controversial calls started getting saved. Databases were being built. Comparisons were being documented. The fan base was essentially creating an archive of every decision the league made regarding their player. And with each subsequent technical, they added to that archive. By the time the 6th technical arrived in July, fans weren't reacting to a single disputed call anymore. They were reacting to a file they'd been building since spring. Screenshot by screenshot, box score by box score. Every whistle they considered questionable, cataloged, discussed, held up against a pattern they were increasingly convinced the league either couldn't see or was actively choosing not to address. The June call didn't just cost Clark money. It cost the league something more valuable. It cost them the benefit of the doubt from a fan base that had already been paying close attention and was now paying attention with a magnifying glass trained on every single decision. This is the crucial moment where the situation transformed from individual incidents into something systematic. One questionable call can be dismissed as a referee having a bad angle or an off night. But when the same league resguns similar calls for other players while upholding one for Clark, it creates a pattern. Patterns invite questions. Questions demand answers. And when answers don't come, people start drawing their own conclusions. That's exactly what happened starting in June. The fans who started documenting these calls weren't conspiracy theorists. They were people who loved basketball and cared about fairness. They were people who'd watched enough games to know what normal officiating looks like. And what they were seeing wasn't normal. It was inconsistent, it was selective, and it was concentrated on one player. The more they documented, the more convinced they became that something structural was wrong. Not just with one referee or one bad call, but with how the system itself was treating Clark compared to everyone else. What made this different from typical fan complaint was the organization behind it. There was no formal structure, no official campaign, no spokesperson. It was just fans, lots of them, noticing something, documenting it, and sharing it. But that organic, decentralized approach made it harder to dismiss. These weren't people being paid to complain. These weren't people with an agenda beyond wanting consistency. They were just pointing out what they saw, backing it up with evidence, and asking reasonable questions. The June Technical became the origin point for everything that followed. It was the moment when a fan base that had been passively watching became actively engaged in tracking every decision. It was the moment when trust in the league's fairness started to erode. And it was the moment when the conversation shifted from being about one player's behavior to being about the system that was disciplining that player. What makes this situation much harder for the league to dismiss as just fan frustration or online noise is who else has decided to speak about it publicly. This is where things get serious. Because when coaches start talking about officiating patterns, when head coaches go on record acknowledging problems, that's a signal that something real is happening inside the organization. Stephanie White is Indiana's head coach. She's not a fan account. She's not a social media commentator with no accountability for what she says. She's a professional coach whose entire job depends on managing her team with precision and speaking about officiating in ways that don't create additional conflict with the league office. Think about what it means when a head coach decides to speak publicly about an officiating pattern. Head coaches generally avoid this kind of conversation because it creates tension with the league office. It can draw fines. It can create problems. It can make officials uncomfortable in ways that might affect future games. There's a real cost to going on record about officiating inconsistencies. And yet, Stephanie White did it. She spoke to reporters after an earlier technical and told them that there needed to be conversations about being more strategic with how those fouls were being used against her own player. Read that carefully. A head coach speaking on the record, acknowledging that Clark's relationship with WNBA officiating has become something the organization has to actively manage. Not something they hope goes away. Not something they're dismissing as an overreaction from the internet. Something they are strategically planning around because it's affecting their team's ability to function. That's the kind of statement that only comes when a problem has become serious enough that it can't be ignored anymore. When a coaching staff is choosing its words this carefully in public about a pattern this visible, it tells you everything about how serious the issue has become inside the organization itself. They're not being casual about this. They're not treating it as a minor annoyance. They're planning around it. National media has been paying attention too, and they've brought a different kind of framework to the conversation. Commentators across major sports outlets have started using language like political tug-of-war to describe the dynamic around Clark's treatment. Praised as the league's biggest draw one week. Disciplined more visibly than her peers the next. That framing, that there's some kind of political dynamic at play, is significant because it elevates the conversation beyond just sports. It makes it about institutional fairness and inconsistency. Once that framing escapes WNBA-specific coverage and enters mainstream sports conversation, something important happens. The league loses control of the narrative. When a story breaks out of the sport-specific media bubble and enters mainstream sports conversation, it reaches a much wider audience. It reaches casual fans. It reaches people who aren't deeply invested in women's basketball, but who care about fairness in sports generally. These people don't have the context that dedicated WNBA fans have. They don't know the history of Clark's season. They don't know the details of every technical foul. But they hear player getting disciplined more harshly than peers, and they immediately understand the problem. They understand inconsistency. They understand unfairness. That's a different kind of pressure than a strongly worded tweet from an organized fan base. That's the league's reputation being shaped in real time by a conversation it didn't choose to start and cannot simply wait out until everyone gets bored. When ESPN is talking about it, when mainstream sports columnists are writing about it, when the story is being picked up by publications that don't normally cover women's basketball, that's when the league knows it's in a different situation. The story has become too big to ignore. The story has become too big to contain. What makes the coaching staff's comments particularly powerful is the contrast they create with league silence. Here's a coach, someone with real institutional power and real skin in the game, saying that this is a serious problem that requires active management. And here's the league office saying nothing, just continuing to issue fines, just continuing to make calls, just continuing with business as usual. The silence from the league starts to look like a response in itself. It starts to look like either they don't believe there's a problem, or they're choosing not to address it. The sports media ecosystem works differently than it used to. Stories don't stay contained in one corner anymore. They spread, they grow, they evolve. Once Stephanie White speaks on record about the pattern, that becomes part of the conversation that national commentators are having. Once national commentators start using language like political tug-of-war, that becomes part of what casual fans are reading. The story gains momentum through each level of the media food chain. By the time it reaches the mainstream sports conversation, the league has already lost the ability to control how it's being framed. And that matters. That matters a lot, because the league's credibility depends on being perceived as fair and consistent. Once that perception is damaged, once the broader sports world is questioning whether the league is treating one player unfairly, the damage is hard to undo. Look at where Clark actually sits in the league's technical foul standings, and the picture becomes even harder to explain away. She's currently tied for second in the entire league, sitting behind only Angel Reese and level with Kahleah Copper. Now here's where it gets interesting. Those are three players whose games look almost nothing alike. Understanding why that matters requires understanding what each of these players actually does on the court. The fact that they've ended up in the same disciplinary bracket isn't just unlikely. It's statistically strange enough to demand explanation. Angel Reese is a physical interior presence who plays with an edge and draws contact. She's a post player. She's involved in physical, contested moments constantly. She plays a style of basketball that inherently involves more body-to-body contact than most positions. She plays aggressively. She plays with an attitude. The physicality of her game, the nature of her position, the way she plays, all of that creates opportunities for technical fouls. Her playing style almost naturally predisposes her to accumulate fouls more easily than guards. You can see how she'd end up with a high technical foul count. It fits her game. It makes sense within the context of how she plays. Kahleah Copper is an aggressive two-way guard who attacks the basket relentlessly. She's creating collisions through her own aggressive approach to the game. She's constantly driving. She's constantly involved in contested moments near the rim. She's getting hit, creating contact, and playing in ways that naturally produce technical fouls more often than other positions. Like Reese, her playing style, aggressive, attacking, physical, aligns with the kind of temperament that might produce technical fouls. You can draw a line between her playing style and her technical foul count. Then there's Clark. Clark is a perimeter playmaker whose entire offensive identity is built around spacing, passing, and shooting. She's not playing in the post. She's not relentlessly attacking the basket in ways that create physical contact. She's running an offense based on floor spacing, ball movement, and three-point shooting. Her game doesn't rely on contact-heavy, emotionally combustible play. Her game doesn't inherently create the kind of contested, physical moments that Reese and Copper regularly occupy. So what exactly explains three completely different players ending up in the same disciplinary bracket by the midpoint of the season? The shared number is harder to explain as coincidence than it initially sounds. It invites serious questions. Why is a perimeter playmaker, whose game is built on spacing and shooting, accumulating technical fouls at the same rate as a physical post player who plays an inherently more contact-heavy game? Why are three players whose on-court styles are fundamentally different all sitting in the same disciplinary position? These aren't rhetorical questions. These are questions that should have answers. These are questions that the league should be able to explain if the system is working fairly. When those questions don't get answered clearly by the people in charge, fans fill the silence with their own conclusions. That's human nature. People see a pattern. People ask why the pattern exists. And when the people who created the pattern refuse to explain it, people decide for themselves what the explanation is. The ones they're reaching aren't favorable to the league office. They're reaching conclusions about inconsistency, about selective enforcement, about unfairness. Consider what the technical foul rankings actually represent. Technical fouls are supposed to be about player behavior. They're supposed to be about outbursts, disrespect to officials, emotional displays that cross a line. If the system is working correctly, players with similar behavior should have similar technical foul counts. But Clark's behavior, her on-court demeanor, her composure, her playing style, doesn't match the playing styles of Reese and Copper. She's a different kind of player. She plays a different position. She plays with a different intensity and physicality, and yet she has the same technical foul count. That statistical anomaly is impossible to ignore if you're paying close attention, and the fans were paying close attention. Once they noticed it, they pointed it out. They created graphics. They made comparisons. They documented the mismatch between Clark's playing style and her technical foul count compared to other players with similar counts. The more they documented, the harder it became to explain away as simple coincidence or normal variance. The statistical reality creates its own kind of pressure. Numbers don't lie. Numbers don't have agendas. Numbers are just information. And the information contained in the technical foul statistics was pointing to something that didn't add up. A perimeter playmaker shouldn't have the same technical foul count as a physical post player if the system is being applied consistently. That's just basic logic. And when people see something that doesn't add up mathematically, they want answers. They demand answers. And when answers don't come, they start reaching their own conclusions about why the numbers don't make sense. The fan base has responded to that silence with something that's remarkable precisely because it emerged entirely without any formal structure behind it. No organization, no central coordination, no official headquarters, no spokesperson. Just collective action that grew organically out of frustration and a desire for accountability. What started as individual fans noticing something wrong grew into a coordinated movement without anyone actually coordinating it. That's the kind of grassroots response that institutions struggle to manage because there's no single person or group to negotiate with. Every technical foul now generates an immediate wave of real-time commentary and documentation. Fans are literally refreshing box scores during fever games specifically to track whether Clark has picked up a foul that moves her closer to that suspension threshold. During the game, in real time. That's a level of engagement that goes way beyond normal sports fandom. These aren't casual observers. These are people who are genuinely invested in tracking what's happening, and they're documenting it as it happens. So by the time the game ends, there's already a conversation happening about whether the technical was fair, whether it was consistent with how other players are treated, and what it means for Clark's standing. Screenshot threads catalog every disputed call with timestamps and video evidence. Someone will pull the clip, timestamp it, provide context for why they think it was or wasn't a legitimate technical. They'll compare it to other calls from other games. They'll show how that exact same situation was handled differently for another player. These threads are thorough. They're organized, they're persuasive, they're the kind of documentation that makes it very hard to dismiss the concerns as just fan complaining. These are people building a case, they're gathering evidence, they're creating a public record. Comparison posts hold up Clark's technical history next to players whose conduct is objectively similar or considerably worse. The fans are doing the league's job for it. They're doing the comparative analysis that a fair disciplinary system should already be doing internally. They're showing, side by side, how players with more egregious behavior are getting treated differently than Clark. This is not random venting. This is a fan base that has effectively transformed itself into a fact-checking department. Organized, persistent, completely unwilling to let any single call pass by unexamined. They're holding the league accountable to its own standards. What does it mean for a league office when the people watching its games this closely are building a public record of every decision it makes? That kind of sustained, documented attention is its own form of pressure, even without a formal campaign, a petition, or an official spokesperson. There's no petition to dismiss. There's no formal organization to negotiate with or discredit. It just keeps existing. It keeps growing every time a new chapter gets added to the story. Every new technical foul adds another data point. Every new disputed call gets screenshotted and documented. The record just keeps getting more complete. The power of this approach is that it's impossible to ignore and impossible to contain. You can dismiss a petition. You can say a formal campaign is organized activism. You can point to a spokesperson and say they have bias. But you can't dismiss thousands of individual fans, each documenting what they see and sharing it. You can't dismiss video evidence with timestamps showing inconsistent enforcement. You can't dismiss side-by-side comparisons of how different players are treated. You can't dismiss the math that shows Clark shouldn't statistically be in the same disciplinary bracket as physically different players. The fan base has essentially created a parallel investigation into officiating practices. They're not waiting for the league to conduct an internal review. They're not waiting for sports journalists to dig into the story. They're doing it themselves. They're creating the evidence. They're building the case. They're making it impossible for anyone to claim they don't know about the problem or haven't noticed the inconsistency. The record is public. The evidence is documented. The comparison is clear. This kind of fan-powered accountability is relatively new in sports. Social media made it possible to coordinate without official coordination. It made it possible to document and share information instantly. It made it possible for thousands of people to work on the same project, in this case, documenting officiating inconsistencies, without ever needing a formal structure. The fans are using the tools available to them in 2024 to create transparency that the league isn't providing internally. The psychological toll of being at the center of this kind of sustained attention is significant. Every game becomes a documented moment. Every interaction with an official gets analyzed. Every word gets examined. For a player, especially a young player in the middle of her prime years, that's an enormous amount of pressure. It's exhausting. But from the fan base's perspective, they're doing exactly what they should be doing. They're paying attention. They're demanding fairness. They're holding power accountable. The methods are new, but the goal is as old as sports itself, making sure the rules are applied fairly to everyone. There's also a financial dimension to this situation that deserves more scrutiny than it typically gets. The WNBA quietly restructured its fine system heading into the season, and understanding what that restructuring actually does is crucial to understanding the full picture of what Clark is facing. It's not just about fairness in officiating anymore. It's about an economic system that amplifies the pressure on players who are accumulating technical fouls at high rates. Under the new framework, technical fouls 4 through 7 each carry a $1,000 penalty. Think about that number for a second. $1,000 per foul. That's a dramatic jump from the $200 starting point of previous seasons. The change was implemented across the board, applied equally to everyone in the league. On paper, that's fair. Same rules for everyone. But in practice, it lands differently depending on who is accumulating the fouls. For a player like Clark, who is approaching the suspension threshold faster than almost anyone else in the league, the financial cost of showing frustration has been climbing steeply and quickly. By the time she picked up her 6th technical, she'd already paid $6,000 in fines. That's a meaningful amount of money, even for a professional athlete. But the structure means it only gets worse from here. The 7th technical carries another $1,000. The 8th technical comes with a $1,500 fine plus the automatic 1-game suspension. The financial burden keeps escalating as the accumulation increases. And if you believe, as Clark does, that the technical fouls are being applied inconsistently, then you're paying thousands of dollars to compensate for a system that you believe is broken. $1,000 per technical foul sounds like a number that a professional athlete should be able to absorb without much concern. Professional basketball players make significant salaries. The money matters, but it shouldn't be devastating. But the deeper issue isn't the dollar amount. It's what the fine structure reveals about the league's actual priorities. The message embedded in a restructuring that raises fines while leaving consistency issues unaddressed is worth examining closely. Raising the cost of player frustration, while the consistency of the calls producing that frustration stays exactly where it was, shifts the entire burden onto the player. It essentially says that the answer to inconsistency is to make it more expensive to react to it. If the system was applying technicals consistently and fairly, then higher fines would just be a graduated penalty system. But if the system is applying technicals inconsistently, which is what Clark and her supporters believe, then higher fines are actually penalizing players for the league's own unfairness. It's not addressing the root problem. It's just making the symptom more expensive. That framing has not gone unnoticed by supporters who believe the officiating problem is the underlying cause, not the result of Clark's behavior. They see a league that's identified a problem, players accumulating technical fouls, and instead of addressing why that's happening, just decided to make it more expensive. It's like a doctor treating a fever by making ice packs more expensive instead of diagnosing and treating the infection causing the fever. It doesn't solve the problem. It just makes the symptom hurt more financially. Clark herself has not framed this as a personal grievance. She's been notably careful about that, steering the conversation consistently away from individual calls and toward a structural argument instead. That's a strategic choice that shows maturity and political awareness. She could complain about specific calls. She could demand that specific technicals be rescinded. She could make this about her personal treatment. Instead, she's done something much more powerful. She's made it about the system. Her ask, the one she's repeated publicly throughout the season, is for full-time referees instead of the part-time officiating system the league currently relies on. That's a meaningful distinction that changes the entire conversation. She's not asking for preferential treatment. She's not asking the league to go back and rescind specific calls in her favor. She's not demanding that officials be fired or that anyone face consequences. She's making the argument that inconsistency in officiating is fundamentally a staffing and infrastructure problem, and that fixing it would benefit everyone on the floor, not just her. That argument gives her position a credibility that pure frustration wouldn't carry. It reframes the conversation from Clark thinks she gets too many technical fouls to Clark thinks the league's officiating structure needs to improve. Those are two very different arguments. The first one is easy to dismiss as complaining. The second one is much harder to dismiss without looking like you're choosing not to fix a problem you could actually solve. If the league says no to full-time referees, they're essentially saying they're choosing not to address what Clark is identifying as a structural problem. What makes this argument powerful is that it's not about Clark. It's about the integrity of the league. It's about fairness. It's about whether the WNBA wants to be a league where officiating is consistent and professional. Full-time referees would presumably be better trained, more consistent, more accountable. They would presumably know the rules more thoroughly. They would presumably be less likely to make the kind of judgment call mistakes that are happening currently. So when Clark asks for full-time referees, she's not asking for special treatment. She's asking for what the league should want for itself if it's serious about its own integrity. So what actually happens if the 8th technical arrives? Strip away the drama and the mechanics are straightforward, but the implications are anything but simple. The moment Clark picks up her 8th technical foul of the regular season, the WNBA automatically suspends her for 1 game. No hearing, no appeal process that changes the outcome, no discretion. It's automatic. A $1,500 fine added on top of it. A mandatory night sitting on the bench while her team plays without her. That's the mechanical reality of the rule. It's clear, it's well established, it's the same for everyone. For most players on most teams in most seasons, that would be an inconvenience. You miss 1 game, your team has to adjust. You come back the next game. It's not great, but it's manageable. Athletes deal with suspensions all the time. But for the Fever right now, in the middle of a tight playoff race, it would be considerably more serious than that. Indiana is sitting at 15 wins and 10 losses, locked in a playoff race in a conference that has tightened significantly as the season has progressed. Every game matters. Every win matters. Every loss matters. This isn't a team that can afford to lose a game. This is a team that's fighting for positioning, and every single game carries playoff weight. Clark is averaging close to 21 points, nearly 8 assists, and 4 rebounds per night. Those numbers don't sound quite as historically dominant as some other great players, but they're consistent. They're reliable. They're the foundation of everything the Fever does. More importantly, she's not just Indiana's best player. She's the gravitational center of everything the Fever runs on offense. She's the player whose ability to create open looks for her teammates fundamentally changes how the defense has to position itself. When she's on the floor, the offense functions in a specific way. When she's off the floor, the Fever have to run an entirely different system. She's the player whose shooting range alone forces defensive adjustments that no other player on the roster can demand in the same way. Teams have to respect her three-point shot. They have to account for her from 30 feet away. That's not normal. That's elite. That changes how defenses construct themselves. Remove her for one game and the Fever aren't just missing a scorer. They're running an entirely different offensive system on 48 hours. Notice in the middle of a stretch, where every single game carries playoff weight. How does a team reroute its entire offensive identity that quickly, without months of practice and preparation built around a different approach? Honestly, it doesn't. Not cleanly. Not without cost. The Fever have spent the entire season building chemistry around Clark's presence. The spacing works because of her. The ball movement works because of her. The offensive flow works because of her. Take her out, and you're asking the team to improvise. You're asking them to adapt on the fly to a system they haven't been running. You're asking them to maintain their competitiveness without the player who makes them competitive. That's hard. And in a playoff race, you can't afford many hard games. One loss because Clark is suspended could be the difference between making the playoffs and missing the playoffs. One loss could be the difference between a good playoff seed and a worse one. In a competitive conference, margins are thin. Clark's absence for even one game could have cascading effects on Indiana's entire season trajectory. But the damage from a suspension wouldn't stop at Indiana's record for that one night. Every game Clark appears in this season comes with something the league has spent years trying to generate: elevated attendance, elevated television ratings, and a level of mainstream national attention that women's basketball has historically struggled to sustain consistently. The numbers are undeniable. Every arena she visits sells out. Teams hosting the Fever mark their attendance records. Broadcasters point to her appearances as reliable drivers of viewership. When the Fever are on TV, people watch. When Clark is playing, the ratings go up. The league has openly credited her presence with accelerating the growth of the sport in ways that no single marketing campaign could have produced. Think about the position that puts the league in. They've spent 2 years saying that Clark is the most important thing to happen to women's basketball. They've spent 2 years crediting her with transforming the commercial landscape of the sport. They've made her the face of women's basketball growth. And now they're 2 bad whistles away from sitting her down in the middle of a playoff race. From the league's perspective, that's a problem. From the fans' perspective, that's a contradiction. A suspension doesn't just cost the Fever a player for a night. It costs the league one of its most reliable draws at exactly the moment that casual fans are paying more attention to women's basketball than they ever have before. Is the WNBA actually prepared for what a suspended night looks like in terms of the audience it loses alongside her? What do those ratings look like without Clark? What does the attendance look like without Clark? What does the national conversation look like when the league's biggest star is forced to sit down in the middle of a playoff race because of what many people believe is unfair officiating? That's not a hypothetical anymore. It's a live question sitting 2 technical fouls away from becoming a very real answer. Fans have started treating every single technical foul from this point forward as its own contained drama. There's no more casual watching a Fever game and occasionally checking the score. There's watching a game with forensic attention to every interaction Clark has with officials. Fans are literally refreshing box scores in real time during Fever games specifically to see if Clark has picked up a foul that pushes the counter forward. And when she does, there's an immediate reaction across social media. Screenshots, analysis, comparison to other players, documentation of whether it was fair. Watching her interactions with officials with a level of forensic attention that would be unusual even in a playoff series. Every time she says something to a referee after a call, There's a moment, a collective breath across social media, before people find out whether it resulted in anything. That kind of sustained, granular attention is exhausting for everyone involved, and especially for Clark herself. She's a competitor. She plays with intensity and emotion because that's what competitive basketball at the highest level demands. You can't play at the highest level of basketball without intensity and emotion. The sport requires it. Being asked to manage that intensity not just with the game on the line, but with a suspension countdown ticking in the background, creates a psychological pressure that very few athletes in any professional sport have had to navigate this publicly. She can't just play her game. She has to monitor her own reactions. She has to control her own emotions. She has to maintain a level of composure that most athletes don't need to maintain. And everyone's watching, everyone's documenting, everyone's waiting to see if this next whistle changes everything. How many players in any professional league are expected to regulate their emotional responses this carefully with this much riding on every single whistle? The answer is not many, and the ones who are usually have something in common. They're the biggest names, generating the biggest audiences, carrying the most institutional weight, which brings everything right back to Clark. She's been tasked with an impossible responsibility. Play your best basketball, maintain your intensity, compete at the highest level. But do it while suppressing your natural emotional responses and monitoring yourself constantly, because 2 more technicals end your season. None of this is an argument that Clark should get a pass on legitimate technical fouls. Nobody is making that case. The argument is simpler and less comfortable for the league. It's that the margin for error has become dangerously thin at exactly the moment her performance has never been better, and the stakes for everyone around her, teammates, coaches, broadcasters, the league itself, have never been higher. Is it reasonable to ask any athlete, let alone the most scrutinized one in the sport, to play with that little room between her best season and a forced night off? The answer feels like it should be no. But that's the position she's in. That's the reality of the situation. Every game is the most important game. Every whistle is crucial. Every reaction could be the one that ends her season. Look at everything Clark has already had to manage just to get to this point in the season, and the picture gets heavier. She came into the year dealing with injury concerns that required her coaching staff to implement a minutes restriction that's still in place. Her body required careful management. She couldn't play full minutes. She had to be monitored. She had to be managed like a fragile asset. The physical contact she absorbs on a nightly basis has been documented and debated since her rookie season. A level of contact that's drawn its own separate conversation about how officials are applying the rules consistently when it comes to how she's defended. Now layer on top of that a suspension threshold sitting 2 technical fouls away, a fine structure that penalizes her more steeply with each additional call, and a league office that hasn't publicly responded to the structural concerns she keeps raising. That's a significant amount of pressure concentrated on one player at one time, landing during what should be one of the most celebratory stretches of her career. A week that opened with a 45-point, 10-assist historic performance, and then pivoted immediately into a fine and a suspension countdown. The contrast between those 2 things isn't subtle. It's exactly the kind of contradiction that makes a narrative feel bigger than any individual moment inside it. Friday was supposed to be the story, Friday's historic performance. But by Sunday morning, it was old news. The story had shifted, the conversation had changed, and Clark found herself in the middle of something much bigger than her own performance. For the Fever fan base, this stretch of the season has created a kind of divided attention that no team should have to deal with in the middle of a playoff push. Part of every game is just watching basketball. The basketball part, watching the team compete, watching the offense flow, watching the gameplay develop. Part of every game is watching a counter, waiting to see if this is the whistle that changes everything. That's the undercurrent running through every Indiana broadcast right now. A tension that didn't exist a season ago and only exists because the situation has been allowed to escalate without any clear resolution from the people with the authority to provide one. Everything this situation involves traces back to one central question. Does the WNBA plan to actually answer Caitlin Clark, not with a statement, not with a fine structure update buried in league memo language? actually answer her. Engage with the argument she's been making publicly and repeatedly. That officiating inconsistency is a structural problem with a structural solution. And respond in a way that makes clear the league has heard what she's saying and is doing something meaningful about it. The countdown sits at 2. 2 more technical fouls, and the conversation stops being about what might happen and starts being about what is happening. And everyone's waiting to see how it ends. The countdown sits at 2. 2 more technical fouls, and the conversation stops being about what might happen and starts being about what is happening. 2 more whistles, and the league's most watched player is sitting on the bench for a game that will be covered not as a standard disciplinary outcome, but as the culmination of a story that's been building since June. Every remaining game on Indiana's schedule carries playoff weight. The fan base has built its record. The media has built its narrative. Clark has made her argument. Now the only question left is whether the WNBA is actually listening or whether it's just going to keep cashing the fines and hoping the noise eventually dies down. History suggests it won't. The pressure is already real. The question is already in the room. Is the league actually listening?